So, as you can see from our first slide there, our subject this evening is going to be quite wide. We're going to be talking about candles, we're going to be talking about incense, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Advent. So we've got a little bit to cover here. Let's begin then by talking a little bit about candles and their use in the church. One of the themes of Advent season is the theme of light that gradually dawns in the world. And that's reflected in this increasing light from the Advent wreath. So as each Sunday we light another one of these 5 candles. And the season culminates eventually in the lighting of this central white candle here, you can see on these pictures, that symbolises Jesus, who's the light of the world. So light provides the liturgy with an awful lot of different symbols. For instance, churches are generally oriented to the rising sun in the east. So the altar is in the east for that very specific reason. The rising sun comes in through this great east window. At the west end of the church, traditionally, there's often a depiction of Christ the King, where the sun sets there in these great tympana of the great medieval cathedrals, for instance. Christ is seated at judgment, as he will be at the end of all things. So here, as you can see in Holy Trinity Manhattan West window, you've got a picture of Christ the King. These windows donated, I think, by the Rhinelander family, who incidentally owned this building where I'm sitting at one particular point way back. In fact, in the northern hemisphere, the southern aspect of the church, that is, looking down the church to the right, was often decorated with stories illustrating the New Testament, and the left-hand side of the church, that is the north side, the darker side, was often dedicated to images depicting stories from the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and 1 Samuel, we're told that a flame that was fed by this first pressed virgin oil, that is, hadn't been used for cooking or, I don't know, some other purpose, burned constantly in the tent of meeting on a 7-branched golden lampstand. I like this particular image because you can see the cruises of oil on each side of the 7-branched candlestick here. Can you see these 2 great big jars on either side of the business? Yeah. In Revelation, in the book of Revelation, we're told, hang on, I think I might have another, there, that's the famous picture from the triumphal arch of Titus, is it? Of the looting of the temple in Jerusalem and the 7-branched candlestick being taken away as part of their spoils of war. In the book of Revelation, we're told that the 7 torches of fire burned before the one who sits on the throne. Lights are also mentioned in early Christian assemblies. In the book of Acts, for instance, Acts chapter 20, here's incense and lights burning before the throne. We'll come back to that in a minute. Acts chapter 20 here. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. And there were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. This is a little detail that these lamps and lights, not just because it was dark, it's many lamps are mentioned here. Perhaps also, does anybody remember the name of this little chappie on the left and what happened to him from Sunday school stories? He's the first victim of a sermon, probably. He was sitting at the window and he fell out of the window when he fell asleep listening to Paul's long sermon. Fell onto the ground. Everybody thought he was dead, so Paul ran down the stairs and brought him back to life again, so he could hear the end of the sermon, presumably. His name was Eutychus, if you remember that from Sunday school or something. This is Paul preaching in Troas in Acts chapter 20. Now, in the 200s, this is very early, the lighting of these lamps at nightfall inspired some of the most beautiful Christian prayers, like the Phos hilaron, which we still use in evening prayer and lucernaire today, the order for evening prayer. So here it is: O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed, now as we come to the setting of the sun and our eyes behold the vesper light, those are the candles that we light at that time, we sing your praises, O God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. You are worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the worlds. Here it is in the familiar French words of our Book of Common Prayer.
Joie et lumière de la gloire éternelle.
Oui, du Père, le très haut, le très saint, ô Jésus-Christ, parvenus à la fin de ce jour, contemplant cette clarté dans le soir, nous chantons le Père et le Fils et le Saint-Esprit de Dieu. Oui, tu es digne d'être chanté dans tous les temps par des voix sanctifiées. Fils de Dieu qui donne vie, tout l'univers te rend gloire. And here, finally, you'll see it in the original Greek. This one's for Patrick. And for Joris, probably. And perhaps for Catherine Hendry, who's probably sung it in Greek at the cathedral, the Phos Hilaron. Now, liturgical scholars believe that the Paschal Candle had its origin in this very service. Lights here are a sign of joy, a reminder of a holy presence, and they're also a symbol of the prayer to which they give this sort of outward physical expression. Approaching a place that is lit by candlelight invites the sort of intimacy that inspires prayer in people. This is a very natural instinct, and you can see it very often playing out in all sorts of different ways. Here, this is a Coptic church in Egypt, and these candles that are lit around the tombs of the martyrs. The martyrs to the ISIS movement also had these candles lit around the whole of the Coptic church in their memory. It's a very natural instinct, and we can see it playing out in all sorts of unusual places. True inspiration, Diana, unforgettable there. The first instinct of people way back then, when Diana was killed in that car crash, was to gather round and not just offer flowers, but light these candles. You can also see it, I remember after 9/11, down in Union Square, all of these candles being lit in Union Square. And very often for the victims of gun violence, the candles are lit too. So you can see it's a human instinct to light this thing as a sign of hope, as a sign of intimacy, as a sign of the unquenchable light that death can't stamp out. So it's a very natural liturgical impulse, this. It's nothing obscure or magical or anything. In the time of the early church, these candles appeared around the tombs of the martyrs, then they appeared in basilicas, then in front of altars and icons, and here, as we can see at a much later date, a single light was left burning in front of the Blessed Sacrament. If you reserved a host from Sunday, put it somewhere inside your altar here, the liturgical rubrics require that a light must be constantly lit in front of the reserved sacrament. That light is often white and sometimes red. For the Virgin Mary, it's always blue, obviously. This is the Church of the Transfiguration in Dallas that has a particularly jolly one that I found online. Roman protocol required any high dignitary to be given this escort of honour, which included a group of people who were carrying candles. I couldn't find one where they were carrying candles. These all seem to be swords in a very Roman way. Now, that honour in the church was first given to bishops. And in the earliest church records, these bishops were escorted by a group of 7 candle bearers. And after the bishop wound his way to his chair, these candles, these 7 processional candles, were mounted on stands near the altar. And that's why even today some churches require 7 candles on the altar if a bishop or the Pope or somebody is presiding. So here we can see St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and you're thinking, what's all that clutter there on the altar? How on earth are they going to celebrate communion with all of that going on? Well, this is a sort of leftover from the Roman ceremonial, where these 7 candles would be carried in procession around a high dignitary. The 2 candles that are now carried by acolytes, here you can see an example of this, once again in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, I believe, judging by the mosaics. These 2 candles, or these 2 torches that are carried by acolytes, are a survival of this practice. Normally 2 candles accompany the person who's presiding, or a bishop, and then 2 candles or the cross that comes at the head of the procession, and then 2 candles on either side of the gospel. So the same honour is of this candle procession is given to the gospel. Here you can see people are carrying the candles. You can't see the top of them here, but these are candles either side. This is in a Methodist service, I believe. So the gospel is carried in procession here with a similar cortege of candles around it. Now, for reason of tradition, the candles that are used in the liturgy are made at least partially of beeswax. And this evokes 2 things, well, many things in the Bible. First of all, the land of milk and honey, that where the bees are present, there's the promise of this fertile land that will bring forth its riches, as we hear in the Bible, about God promising to the Hebrews a land of milk and honey. And secondly, it evokes another story, this story of Samson, the little parable that Samson tells, where he finds this slaughtered lion, and the bees have made their ruche, what's it called? Beehive inside the lion, and the answer to the riddle that he gives, that strength brought forth sweetness. So the strength of Christ there that's evoked in this story, or prefigured in this story, brings forth the sweetness of this honey, the promised land on the cross. So it's one of the ways in which this is prefigured when beeswax is used in these candles in the churches. I'm coming back to that one in a minute. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Let me go this way instead. Let's just look at this picture just for 1 minute. Traditionally, the symbolism of these candles goes something like this. The beeswax of these candles, here's the great Paschal Candle here, let's take that as an example. The beeswax symbolizes Jesus' body. The wick of the candle symbolizes Jesus' soul. And the flame on the top of the candle symbolizes Jesus' divinity. So each one of these candles, the light of the world, is taken as a symbol of all of these things. Now, the use of candles on the altar was very controversial in the Reformation, partly as a result of some of this fanciful imagery, fanciful symbolism that grew around the use of candles, partly because sometimes these candles were used in the medieval period for all sorts of other reasons. For instance, any leftover bit of the Paschal Candle was melted down and then impressed with an image of John the Baptist. It was then put in a little pouch or a little pocket, and people could buy this or take it home and hang it around the neck of cattle to avoid cattle diseases, or keep it in the house to avert storms. So the candles had been used for all of these purposes during medieval period, and I think the Reformation Church thought that this looked all too much a bit like superstition and magic, so they abandoned the imagery of the candle altogether and had no candles even on the altar. Well, we've discovered already that the Reformation liturgists, such as they were, tried to strip the communion service of too much of this outward symbolic reference, if it wasn't a sacrament. Anything to add?
I think Lutherans and Luther was agreed with candles, but not.
He liked candles.
Yeah, he liked candles.
Yeah.
But not Calvin and Zwingli, of course.
And Zwingli didn't like them. No.
What did Zwingli like?
Zwingli didn't like much, perhaps. Now, in the Anglican Church, 2 candles on the altar are considered sufficient. A row of 6 on the altar, or on a shelf behind the altar, is considered terribly Roman and a sort of relatively modern invention. Now, more than 2 candles, unless you're celebrating Lucernaire or something, is considered to be distracting, and we'll see why in a moment. One of the problems I find with all of these candles on an altar is that it's going to be obscuring what's going on behind there. This thing behind is sometimes the most beautiful part of a church, the reredos. Where's the cross here? What's happened? All of a sudden, this whole silver gilt business is no longer serving a sort of symbolic purpose. It seems more to do with show and grandeur and fuss. And so we're losing the point of the symbolism of light here. It's suddenly become about something else. And it's suddenly obscuring something that you actually want to see. The symbolism of 2 candles on an altar, this is a cathedral in Ireland, varies from denomination to denomination. There's no one single way of interpreting these 2 candles. In the Anglican Church, or at least in Anglican or Episcopalian churches that are fussy about these things, the candle on the left-hand side of the altar is known as the Gospel Candle. That's this candle here. And the candle on the right of the altar is known as the Epistle Candle. The candles are going to be lit in order of importance. So from most important to least important. So if a Paschal candle is lit in the church, the Paschal candle is the most important candle. So you're going to light that one first. Second come the 2 candles on the altar. Those are the second most important candles. If there's no Paschal candle, the 2 candles on the altar are the most important candles. And this, if you're fussy about it, is the order in which the candles are lit. First of all, you're going to light the epistle side, the right-hand side here of the altar. And secondly, you're going to light the gospel candle on the left-hand side of the altar. You might be thinking, why is this? Well, because the proclamation of the message, the prophets of the Old Testament and what have you, precede the coming of Christ, the light of the world, in the gospel side. So it's slightly counterintuitive, because you'd think, well, if they're lit in order of importance, surely you should be lighting the gospel side first. But for some bizarre reason, and this is why there's a lot of argument and nonsense about this in some rather prissy altar guilds that want things to be done in certain orders, to say, no, the gospel side should be lit first. But according to older Christian tradition, it says, light right first, then light left. If you have any other candles to light, you light them from the middle outwards. You don't go, I've lit this one and I've lit this one, now I'm going to come down and light all the ones in the middle. Why is this? Basically because the symbolism here is the light flows out from the cross in the middle. Jesus is the light of the world. And if you've got a bunch of other candles that are hovering around here, you're going to light them spreading out from the cross in the middle. As we saw here, if you're going to be doing that here, where's your symbolism? where's the cross going on? Maybe the tabernacle here. We're not even really very sure if Jesus is inside this, probably. But since there's a mass going on, perhaps not. So sometimes these extra candles can obscure this particular idea that if you're lighting candles on an altar, you want the light to flow from the middle, from the symbol of Jesus, the light of the world. So then if it comes to extinguishing these candles, you're going to extinguish them in reverse order. So you're going to, the peripheral candles, if you've got any candles that are, there for other reasons, are going to be extinguished last. If you have a Paschal candle in the church, the flame from the Paschal candle is going to be used to light the other candles on the altar. So you're carrying the flame of the Paschal candle that is standing for the resurrection to light all of these other candles that you've got around. Methodist churches often have two candles, rather like the Anglicans. And in the Methodist church, sometimes I've heard people saying that they symbolize that Jesus was both a human being and was God. So it symbolizes the dual nature of Jesus. And sometimes in a Methodist church, perhaps, at the end of the service, an acolyte will carry the lights out of the church into the world to show that Jesus is for people, all people, everywhere. So, let's talk for a minute about incense. Now we've explained a little bit about candles. Joris, is there anything you wanted to say about candles? Anything more?
No, I mean, when you mentioned the wax too, and the fact that traditionally it's beeswax, although it's more expensive, of course. But the bee, as you mentioned, is related to the sweetness, but it's also related to the word of God, because in Hebrew, davar means, like Deborah, for instance, the name Deborah means bee, and there's the Hebrew Bible plays a lot on the root between word and bees and bee, and so the smell of the beeswax is also kind of the smell of the word through all these associations, and the light is also the light of the word. So you have all these different symbols that can be associated to the wax and bees and candles and the word of God together.
Nice, thank you. Let's have a little think now about incense, perhaps one of those things that's still a little bit controversial. Incense has got a very long and a very rich history in religious ceremonies. One of the very first mentions of its use was by the Egyptians in the 5th dynasty. This is King Sahure. You can see him on the right here. And he, his pyramid is a little dilapidated. But we know that he made an expedition to the land of Punt in about 2400 BC. Egyptologists still don't know exactly where the land of Punt was, but we certainly know what came from the land of Punt. Frankincense, myrrh, ivory, apes, peacocks, ebony. So these are all listed in these great inscriptions, very often on later period tombs. But here we can see King Sahure is boasting about this great expedition to Punt, and one of the things that he brings back from Punt is a great hoard of frankincense and myrrh. Now, the fact that it's mentioned here for the first time must mean that it's been used. It was used very much even before that particular period. Incense that's used in churches, or in other places too, is usually a mixture of frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense, here you go, there's a little picture of it, is the resin from the Boswellia genus of bush. I don't know if you remember, I didn't put a slide of this in, but do you remember how Egyptian pharaohs, think of Tutankhamun's death mask, and you'll see that his arms are crossed in this thing. And in one hand, he's holding something that looks like a shepherd's crook. And in the other hand, he's holding something that looks like a fly whisk. It's a sort of a long stick with tassels on it. Now, people think that this long stick with tassels on it was the way in which incense was harvested. In other words, you would throw these tassels into the tree that were made of knotted leather or something, pull it through the tree, and the resin would collect on these long fronds. Sahuré is the only Egyptian pharaoh ever depicted gardening, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's collecting incense from one of these bushes. So it's believed that this sacred connection between incense, between frankincense and myrrh, dates back to that particular period where even the pharaoh is honoured to be able to collect this to be used in the temples. Here's a picture of a frankincense tree. You can see it's a little woody, shrubby looking thing. You can see how its resin collects there, exuded from the bark of the tree. Myrrh, there's a frankincense flower. I'd love to be able to smell one. It's a very beautiful looking thing. Maybe it doesn't smell at all, who knows? Perhaps it's a bit like orchids. Apart from vanilla. Vanilla is an orchid, isn't it? And that smells good. Although I've never smelled a flower.
Yes, I'm not sure the flowers.
Perhaps the flowers don't smell. They have other ways of attracting pollinators, perhaps. Here's myrrh. You can see it's a thorny little bush, very small, of the genus Commiphora. And both frankincense and myrrh were also used in medicines, especially the latter. There is a tincture of myrrh. It could be mixed with wine if you wanted to have a nice time. I suppose it was a bit like marijuana. I've never tried it, but there we go. Or it could be used as a painkiller in the ancient world as well, myrrh. So it has these two very strong associations. That's why they say, you know, that Christmas carol of the Three Kings, myrrh I bring, its bitter perfume bodes a life of gathering gloom. It's not just that myrrh was used in embalmment, it was also used to take away the pain of diseases. So it has this association with illness or physical pain as well. The incense offering had a central role in the sacrificial codes of the Hebrews. In Exodus, frankincense is blended with these other aromatic spices, and it's burned on a sacred altar in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And Jeremiah says that frankincense was imported from Sheba, which could be the Egyptian Punt, the Queen of Sheba. You know, the Horn of Africa, basically, Ethiopia. And Eritrea, I suppose, nowadays. It's mentioned in the New Testament as one of the three gifts, like myrrh, of the Magi. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The first chappie here seems to be carrying the gold. This is the frankincense. Note the shape of this thing. It looks like a boat. We're going to be coming across that again in a minute. And here, this one is carrying myrrh back here. Myrrh is described as a rare perfume in the Bible too. Jacob, you know the story of Jacob's sons who sold their brother Joseph to a group of traders. Those traders dealt in spices, and they also dealt in balm, and the Bible says that they were myrrh traders as well on their way to and from Egypt, where the myrrh perhaps came from. Incidentally, some of these spices in the Christian world, they weren't entirely completely sure where the spices came from, but they knew that they came down the great rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and they believed that these great rivers bore these spices out of paradise itself, including frankincense and myrrh. So what you did when you burned frankincense and myrrh in in churches was to send back to God something that had come from the Garden of Paradise itself. You were giving back to God what was God's, that God had allowed a smell of paradise to remain with us. Smell is the only sense that still works when you're asleep, apparently, or in deep dream. So that resonance is there as well in the use of incense in church worship. We're offering back to God what came from God. In the book of Exodus, in fact, 6 kilograms of myrrh, it's been frightfully expensive, 6 kilograms of myrrh went into the recipe for the sacred anointing oil that was used. Myrrh was also present, as we know, at Jesus' death and burial. In John's Gospel, Joseph of Arimathea brought a 100-pound mixture of myrrh to wrap Jesus' body in. Now, incense was used in Jewish ritual as a very expressive symbol of prayer. It's mentioned very often in the Bible. In Psalm 141, verse 2, "Accept my prayer like a gift of burning incense, the words I lift up like an evening sacrifice. Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as an evening sacrifice" is probably a better translation of that. I don't know what the ERV is. Do you know, Joris, what version of the Bible that is?
Revised version, evangelical.
The evangelical revised version or something. It's taken the hands out anyway. Incense was burned in the temple in Jerusalem in the morning and in the evening. And in the heavenly temple of Revelation, this same rite continues with the angels and the representatives of the 12 tribes as the ministers. And in that form, these prayers are being offered. I think I had a picture of that back here, didn't I? Sorry, I'm going to make you dizzy for a second. Where was that picture? Yes, here it is. Here you can see these depictions of the book of Revelation. They're casting down their golden crowns, but here you can also see that they're holding up these burning bowls of incense. See this? Here and here, they're playing harps. On this side, we've got crowns, and I sometimes can't tell the bowls from the incense, the bowls from the crowns. And here we can see them. See the little boat shape here of these burning incense boats. Here's the Thoroughball, and here they're throwing the burning coals down onto the world. So you can see that incense in the book of Revelation is talked about as the way in which our prayers ascend up to God. Let me move forward again to where we were. We're about here, aren't we? Good. Now, despite all of these biblical references, and there are many more, there's about 160 references to frankincense, myrrh, incense in the Bible, the Western Church in particular waited a long time before they allowed incense to be burned in the liturgy. And maybe this is because the gesture had rather an idolatrous meaning in the surrounding pagan world in the West. You remember soldiers were required to offer a pinch of incense to the emperor as part of their pledge of allegiance. Christians who refused to do that were often persecuted in the early church. So this use of incense perhaps had some negative connotation for the very earliest Christians, just as the use of certain pagan instruments in worship in the very earliest church had a negative connotation. In the East, it was far more common. In fact, and I think I'm right in this, perhaps when we talk about icons, I'm going to ask Nita if she'd like to contribute to that too. Myrrh is an ingredient that is used in a pigment for the writing of icons. So it's mixed with an egg tempera and forms a part of the icon writing process. But by the end of the 300s, incense burners were being used in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you can see here in Jerusalem. These stationary incense burners on stands were permitted in basilicas to purify the air and to honour the place itself. Or sometimes these incense burners were suspended from chains in front of relics or in front of icons. Today, the use of incense in churches is still perhaps a little bit controversial. Perhaps it's less controversial than it was even just a few decades ago. The reformers didn't approve, for reasons that we can probably now guess, and for a very long time Protestant denominations associated the use of incense with what they denounced as popery, or saw was unnecessary. In fact, when the Oxford movement in England in the middle of the 1800s tried to bring incense back, this was one of the things that caused riots in the streets and people to throw stones and down with popery and all of this sort of business. They either saw it as popish and unnecessary, or they said it was very exotic and very Eastern Orthodox and shouldn't be a part of Western worship at all. But today, I would say that the Book of Worship of the United Methodist Church calls for the burning of incense in evening praise and prayer services. So people have started using it a little bit more in their homes and in their own devotions, and perhaps a little bit more in churches now than we might have seen it in the past. It's another way of reclaiming an ancient Christian tradition and making it relevant to modern worship, or not even making it relevant. Why should things be relevant all the time? It's a bit of a subjective, analytic word. Why shouldn't it give an air of mystery for us to lend our own meaning and significance to it and discover new ways in which the use of this ancient practice can bring meaning to our liturgies in different ways? So let's talk a little bit about the way in which this has been understood. A throughball, a sort of censer, is used to contain this incense while it burns on this sort of previously lighted charcoal briquette that sits inside this thing. As you can see, the throughball, this item here, is suspended on chains. The top half of it lifts up, this little bit here. You can see there's another chain on this hoop at the top here. This chain is controlled by this little hoop here. When you pull this little hoop, the lid of the throughball will lift off and allow you to put a little bit of incense inside it. The incense is carried in this thing that looks like a boat. It flips open halfway like this. There's a little spoon inside, and the celebrant takes a few of those little incense grains that we saw and plops them down on the burning charcoal briquette, which is inside. I'll tell you when that happens and how that happens in a minute. The celebrant, when they're putting the incense, sometimes in the form of a cross on the top of the charcoal briquette, is going to say a little prayer of blessing, and the sign of the cross. This is the one that we used to use in Tottenham. Be thou blessed by him in whose honour thou art to be burned. It's quite a sort of powerful little prayer in some ways, that the burning of this incense is in honour of Christ, and we should never interpret it in any other way. Now, the throughball is then taken by the chain and swung by the priest or the deacon or the server or the acolyte. It doesn't have to be an ordained person that uses this throughball. In fact, very often it's not. The person who's swinging this burner swings it towards whatever it is or whoever it is that is being censed at different points in the liturgy. Now, just like any other symbolism, we'll just stick here for a minute, used in the liturgy, incense is going to draw attention to the fact that something or someone is being set aside in holy time, liturgical time, for holy purposes. And most of all, it's going to be drawing attention to the places and the moments in the service in which Christ is felt to be particularly present, or to focus our attention on those particular moments. So not only does it have these other symbolic meanings that we find in the Bible, not only does it smell good, not only does it add a layer of mystery to what we're doing. Some people don't like the smell of incense, so I shouldn't say it always smells good. No. Very often in Tottenham, it was the people who smoked who had the most objection to it. And they go, "Oh, Father, I've had to come outside for a cigarette. That's really choking me in there." So here is how it is used in most Eucharistic services. During the Introit, the opening of the service, and after the procession down the aisle, the altar is censed very simply in our case, if we're using it, since we're a small church. Now, you'll probably recognise this chap on your screen. This is the rector of St. Thomas, I should call it, St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue, Father Carl, censing the altar at St. Thomas. In a big church or a big cathedral, things are going to get a bit more fancy when you can actually walk around the altar, all the way around it, without breaking something or causing a conflagration, which would probably happen in our case at Saint-Esprit. What the celebrant is going to do is to bow to the cross first. That's the first thing that you do. And then the celebrant is going to cense the cross with 3 double swings. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or sometimes more simply with 3 single swings. 1, 1, 1. Then the celebrant is going to move to the right from the centre. Remember the order in which we light the candles? The celebrant moves right from the centre, swinging the thing 3 times. Once on one side, once in the middle of the left, of the right, and once to the extreme right. And then the celebrant is going to return using a sort of waves-like motion, as Joris pointed out when we were practicing, swinging it in a sort of arc 3 times back to the centre. So you've got 6 swings on one side, then the celebrant bows to the cross again and repeats the same procedure for the left-hand side of the altar. That is to say, 3 single swings, 1 just to the left of the cross, 1 in the middle of the left, 1 at the extreme left of the altar, and then returning again with 3 arc-like swings or wave-like swings to the centre of the altar. Joris, did you want to say anything about that, from your impressions of that when we practiced, and you're pointing out the wave-like motion of this sensing?
Yeah, what I found very powerful in this way of sensing, for instance, but in other also liturgical gestures, is that it's not like an adornment. It's not something added to the rest of the liturgy, but it's really participating in the same type of stylistics. So, for instance, the fact that you swing back, so it's basically doing spirals in one direction and then spirals in another one. So it's echoing so many other movements that are similar. For instance, in the Bible, when you usually have like the style of the Bible where it starts with like one statement, then something happens, then another statement, and then it comes back to the first one. All this like chiasmatic patterns that you find in the Bible are present in the gestures of the liturgy. It's as if like the gestures were kind of a commentary on how the Bible is written. So you see it happening all the time. It's also like it's creating like two waves, if you want, and you have the cross in the middle. So like it's a bit like also the crossing of the Red Sea. So you have all these different meanings that are at play that are very consistent in the Bible in its stylistics.
That's a really good point. That the movements of the liturgy reflect the way in which the Bible is read and reflected on in a sort of spiral referential way that is constantly flowing and coming back. And the use of the censer in this draws people's attention to that. Also, you might say, well, why is the altar censed? It's drawing everybody's attention to this place where the Eucharist is about to be celebrated. And the prayers are going to be said, and the intentionality of the thing is focused as the smoke rises up around the altar itself. Now, once the altar has been censed at the very beginning of the service, the deacon or the acolyte or the person who's in charge of the little throughball will then take the throughball back and hold it still, not swing it around, until we sing or recite the Gloria. And when we sing or recite the Gloria, glory to God in the highest and peace to his people on earth, remember this is the angels' song. And in those great, the song that the angels sang at the Incarnation on the first night of Christmas. And very often those angels are depicted swinging throughballs there up in the heavens, evoking the passage in Revelation. So when the Gloria is sung, the throughball is swung from the full length of the chain. It's not held halfway down and swung back and forth, but gently sways back and forth on the full length of the chain. You see here, Carl is holding it quite close down to the bottom to swing it from this angle. He's not swinging it from up here. But during the Gloria, this whole chain drops down to the side, and the throughball is swung very gently from side to side, because it's being swung to mark the singing of the Gloria. It's not being used to draw attention to the altar, or, as we'll see in a minute, other bits and pieces in the service. Now, just before the Gospel, in the last verse of the hymn that is sung before the Gospel, a little more incense is placed on the coals, if it's not burning enough. Here's another censing of the altar. Anybody recognise him? This is at Smoky Mary's.
It's Reverend Gershon.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And here he is censing the altar at the Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, just off Times Square. They call it Smoky Mary's for a reason. Now, as the Gospel is announced, the reader of the Gospel is going to cense the Gospel book with 3 double swings. Do you remember? That's exactly how you sense the cross. So we're calling to mind the presence of Jesus in these 3 double swings. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. First of all in the center, then to the left, and then to the right of the Gospel book. So once again, it's drawing attention to the fact that we're about to hear the words of Jesus himself read in the Gospel, just as we're about to receive the presence of Christ in the gifts on the altar. The Gospel reader then hands the throughball back to the acolyte, who once again is going to swing the throughball very gently from the full length of the chain during the reading of the Gospel, just like they did in the Gloria. Now, just before the Eucharistic prayer, the gifts of bread and wine are brought forward, and the altar is prepared as normal. Once the hosts are on the paten, and the wine and the water are in the chalice, the celebrant then places a few grains of incense on the charcoal. Now, if the altar hasn't been censed at the beginning of the service, this is the moment when you're going to cense the altar. But then the gifts are censed with 3 cross-like motions of double swings. So as you can see here, these diagrams are not terribly clear, but can you see this funny one on the right-hand side. Here's the chalice and paten in the middle. So you're going to do 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 with the thurible. And then you're going to come round, round, and round. Does that make sense? 3 circles well, they haven't got the arrows quite right on this particular thing. One of these arrows should be going in the other direction. So you do 2 left and 1 right. So these patterns are all in patterns of 3, evoking the Trinity, evoking here with these great circles, the circle of the Trinity and the great symbol of the circle as the symbol of eternity and the shape of the host. Once the gifts have been sensed here, the acolyte then goes and takes the thurible and senses the person who's celebrating with 3 double swings, or 3 single swings. Once again, saying in some ways that the celebrant there is presiding at the Eucharist and is invoking the presence of Christ for the people in the words of institution. So it's linking together the cross, the gospel, the elements on the altar, these patterns of 3, and the person who is about to celebrate communion using the words of Christ. That's why these swings are slightly different. If there's a subdeacon, then they're sensed with 2 double swings, and the people are also sensed to the left and then to the right of the altar with 1 triple swing, 1, 2, 3. So the acolyte is going to bow to the people, and then the people bow back in thanks or in reverence, recognizing the Christ in each one of us, and 3 single swings. That's a very powerful thing to say. You too are involved in this. You too are there, and we're acknowledging the presence of Christ in you, all gathered together, set aside in this holy time for a holy purpose. Sort of unites the whole thing. Now, during communion, the acolyte is going to, or the thurifer, I suppose we should call this person, the thurifer will swing the thurible from the full length of the chain, just like in the Gloria, just like during the reading of the Gospel, until the elevation of the host. That is, at the very end, when we say by him and with him and through him in the power of the Holy Spirit, all honor and glory is yours, Almighty Father. When the celebrant lifts up the chalice and the little host above the altar at the end of the Eucharistic prayer. At that point, the thurifer is going to take the thing by the chain and swing it like this, as opposed to from the full length of the chain, drawing attention there once again to the presence of Christ there in the bread and the wine. Now, I have to say, after saying all of this, I'll come back to that in a minute. In big services, this incense business can be rather a palaver, to say the least. If you have... Is that British slang or something?
I don't know what it means.
A palaver is an unnecessary fuss. I think it probably is British slang.
Tralala.
A tralala in French, yeah. This is what's going to happen. You've got an archbishop. You've got several bishops, or even just one bishop. You've got canons, you've got deacons, you've got subdeacons, you've got acolytes, you've got choir members, you've got the congregation, you've got the priests. All these people need a certain amount of sensing per person. And the whole business can take even longer than the Eucharistic prayer. I'm sorry, but this is something that really gets on my nerves at some diocesan celebrations. You're sitting there, you've schlepped all the way up to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on the subway with all of your togs in a big old bag. You've gone to the trouble of getting all dressed. You're sitting there, you've listened to the bishop's sermon, and then suddenly comes the time of the censing of the altar and the censing of all of the honoured guests and flunkies. And the organ is doing 51 variations on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. And you're thinking, I'm starving. How long is this going to take? And what is it doing to in terms of its symbolism? It's just taking up everybody's time, while the bishop puts his chasuble on back to front by accident and has to do the whole thing all over again while the incense is swinging. So do you see what I mean? Sometimes these things lose their impact because they become things for their own sake. And if we drift away from them in this way, it's to the detriment of the service in the end. It should be direct. It should be simple. It should mean something. It should draw attention to something, and it shouldn't draw attention to itself. I don't suppose there are any magic numbers even that are involved here, though we've talked about 3 and 12 in the censing of the altar, important numbers there. I would rather opt for simplicity and directness in the symbolism than go in for some arcane and elaborate, time-consuming ritual. Perhaps that's just me. Now, one of the most moving places that I've seen incense used in the liturgy, and used it myself, has been in funerals. Obviously, this isn't something that you can find a lot of pictures of on the internet because people's minds are on other things during funerals, generally speaking, than taking photos with their cell phones. I mentioned earlier that the people are censed just before the Eucharist, recognizing that the smoke of the incense as it rises symbolizes all of our prayers rising up to heaven in the Eucharist. Now, just before the casket is taken from the church for the last time, the person who's presiding at the funeral censes the person for the last time, circling the casket, just like one circles the altar. And during that prayer, during that censing, you recognize that the person who has died is now in the hands of the great shepherd of the sheep, and they're no longer under the pastoral care of their priest. They've passed beyond my cure of souls, my care of souls, into the presence of God, where my care of them in that way is no longer something that I carry. And I always find that a very moving moment of the funeral service if incense is used at that particular time, because you're recognizing the sacred presence of that person in church for the last time and honoring them in this way through the use of incense. Have we got anything to add about incense? We're going to be using it for the first time in the 400-year history of Saint-Esprit in church on Sunday for the Thanksgiving service. As I've mentioned there, this is not something that we will be doing very often. We might use it for very special occasions. Or if you all say, this is dreadful, I feel like I'm being pushed up the candle and I don't want to go there, we've become a spiky church, let us know. Say we don't want it, we don't like it. I'm sorry you won't be there to smell it, but you'll be able to see exactly what it means and how it plays out in the service. Well, let's go on to talk a little bit about Advent. This is a Christian word that actually has a pagan origin. In its Roman cultic use, it used to mean the annual coming of these divinities into their temples so that they could visit their devotees. So the god or the goddess whose statue was exposed or present for veneration, the god or goddess was thought to dwell in the midst of the devotees when this Advent happened in the Roman or the Greek temples, the coming of the god or the goddess, for as long as the ceremony lasted, that was. Now, the imperial court in Rome actually used this very same term, an advent, adventus, for the first official visitation of an important person when he or she came into office. And in early Christianity, adventus became the classical term for the coming of Christ among us. And this had a double signification, interestingly. It meant Christ, oh, there's no apostrophe, Christ's incarnation in the flesh that inaugurated the Messianic age, that is, Christ's first coming in the incarnation. And secondly, the Advent season was filled with this idea of Christ's coming in glory, which is going to crown the work of redemption at the end of time, as we hear in the Gospels and Book of Revelation, and is expected in places like Thessalonians and some of the epistles of the New Testament. Now, the origins of Advent as this season of preparation for Christmas actually began in Northern Europe, in Celtic lands, and somewhat in Spain too. In France, in Gaul. Now, the increasing length of the hours of darkness and until the turn of the sun in late December evoked this time of longing and expectation that Advent came to express. Now, because the feast of the Epiphany and the baptism of Christ, just like the Easter Vigil, were seasons when the faithful were baptized. Remember, the faithful are baptized during the Easter Vigil, and they're baptized also in the early church, were baptized at Epiphany, because that was the time that Jesus was baptized and began his public ministry according to the church's calendar. Then Advent might actually originally have been a season of preparation for baptism, just like Lent was originally conceived as a season of preparation for baptism. So the season of Advent was supposed to be devoted to asceticism, that is, deeper spiritual practices, prayer, and more frequent attendance at church. And it wasn't until the late 500s that Advent suddenly made its first appearance in Rome. It had been around in Gaul, in the other Celtic lands, much earlier than this, even in Spain. But in Rome, it was thought of as a sort of liturgical institution rather than this time of increased ascetic practice and devotion, which is why we have a slightly, schizophrenic view of Advent. Is it something we celebrate, or is it like a mini Lent? What exactly is it we're supposed to be doing? We're not supposed to be giving something up like we give up for Lent, but it still has this feeling that we're supposed to be preparing for something, using more spiritual disciplines or whatever it is. Now, as the feast of Christmas became increasingly important in the high Middle Ages, Advent came to be a time of expectation. So it actually fostered this sort of joyful expectation of the Feast of the Nativity, but it also was blended with this idea of directing the thoughts of Christians to this glorious return of Jesus at the end of time. So you can see where it gets this ambiguous feel from. Now, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, this is wonderfully symbolized by the empty throne. The throne of preparation, it's called. The throne that's being prepared for Jesus' second coming. So here, if you see, these are the mosaics in Ravenna and in various other Eastern Orthodox churches, you will see this. There's this empty throne, and you see, why is Jesus not sitting on this? And this is evoking the final judgment. It's a great expectation, adventy sort of thing to be looking at. Here's a very early example of that with these the instruments of the Passion behind here that are instruments of redemption, and the Gospel book sitting here on the throne as evoking the first incarnation, the first coming of Christ, and the empty throne symbolizing the expectation of Christ's coming again. It's called the hetomasia in Greek, the throne of preparation. And so this Christian expectation found a voice in Advent through prophets like Isaiah and John the Baptist, and they became these two major voices of the Western liturgy of Advent. Now, the 4 weeks of Advent come in 2 stages. First of all, the first 2 Sundays of Advent concentrate on the 2 comings of Christ. First of all, Christ incarnate, that is at the Nativity, and Christ as the coming judge. But the second 2 Sundays of Advent suddenly focus on the herald, that is John the Baptist, and the Annunciation to Mary. So this essentially means that the Church celebrates the Annunciation twice. It celebrates it on the 4th Sunday of Advent, and it also celebrates it in, 9 months before Christmas. That would be April, would it? April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. Yeah, in April. I can't remember the exact date of the Annunciation. I suppose it's the 24th of April, if we go by the calendar. These 4 Sundays also sometimes take on the meanings of hope, of prophecy, as I've mentioned, the 2 comings of Christ there, John the Baptist, and then Mary. That's the Eucharistic lectionary. But in the Liturgy of the Hours, these great O antiphons are used. Here they are up on the screen, especially from December the 17th right up through December the 23rd. And these antiphons have been sung in the Western Church, at least, since the time of Charlemagne. So here you can see them. On the 17th of December, the antiphon is O wisdom from on high. These are little antiphons that are put either side of psalms. The second one, O Lord, O Adonai. The third one on the 19th of December. These are all evocations of the titles of Jesus. Wisdom, Lord, the root of Jesse. These all come from Old Testament prophecies from the Bible. O Clavis David, O Key of David. O Oriens, O Dayspring from on high, dawn upon us. This is from the prophet Isaiah. O Rex Gentium, O King of the nations, come. And finally, O Emmanuel, O God is with us. So you can see it's warming us up to the birth of Christ through the use of these little antiphons that come before the Psalms or before the Venite, say, in morning prayer, or before some of the other. And if you look at the words here in Latin and read them from bottom to top, you get E-R-O, aero. Then we get C-R-A-S. So we get ero kras, tomorrow I will come. So finally, when you've finished reading through all of these things, on the 23rd of December, you look back at what you have sung, and in Latin it says, tomorrow I will come. It's quite a moving little thing. I think liturgical scholars believe it happened by accident rather than something that was arranged on purpose.
You see that in the Hebrew Bible too, like acrostiche like this, with different meanings, and
in the Psalms and
in the Psalms, but
too.
some of them are actually playing with, like, creating words like this too. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
It's rather fun to see, isn't it? It's quite a nice thing to discover. Now, anything else to say about that, Joris? It was a very brief introduction to the season of Advent, but we'll be hearing a lot more about it as the weeks go on, including why we use the colour purple in Advent, and what some of the other themes are for the lighting of the Advent wreath. And we'll be able to follow that quite closely through morning and evening prayer as well. You'll be able to see some of these themes of Advent coming through. Now, as a final treat, Joris, would you like to explain what's about to happen? Because I think many of you will have probably already seen that Joris posted, or Fred posted something that Joris had very carefully prepared for us on St. Hilda of Whitby and the season of Advent. But that's actually flowed from something else that Joris is just about to explain to you before we see it.
Yeah. So it's the beginning of the Advent season in some Christian traditions because it starts earlier, so that you have the full experience of Lent replicated in the waiting for the incarnation of Christ. And so at HDS, where I'm still a student for the last year, I'm a member of the Episcopal Anglican group. And we were in charge of the service this week. Every week it's a different faith tradition that's leading the midweek service. And it's also happened to be today. Yesterday was the feast of St. Hilda. You probably watched or were here actually for the study on Celtic Christianity, and she was practicing in the Celtic tradition, although she was from a Germanic culture, but she was practicing in this tradition in which Advent started now, has already started mid-November. And so that was basically a little homily that I did for the gathering of people at HDS. And I also translated it into French and adapted it for our congregation as a little video to start the Advent season and think about what we are going to yearn for during this season and how we can prepare to it together despite this situation too. So that is maybe by lighting some candles at home or lighting some incense if you have, or just wait in this and contemplate this moment of stillness. That's also an experience for a lot of us, or expectation of a Savior too, that we're waiting in this moment of Advent. So Nigel suggested that we played the little video. I'm quite serious on it, you'll see. It was the first prise of the video. It was for HDS, and there is the French version if you want to watch it on our YouTube channel.
So you're going to be treated to the English version tonight, which will not be posted on our YouTube channel because you've already got it in French there. Roughly the same thing, and with nice pictures. So
the French version has pictures added by Fred, yes.
Yes, but this is the English version for us this evening. Let's see if it works.
Looks so serious.
Here we go.
Dear friends, mid-November marks the beginning of Advent in some Christian traditions, especially in the Celtic tradition in which Hilda of Whitby was an abbess. As Christians, we often think of Celtic Christianity as an exotic, if not sentimental version of Christianity, especially related to nature. Yet, what characterizes this most occidental version of early Christianity is not a form of pantheism, but a mysterious experience of God's tidal but constant presence in the created world. Celtic Christians learned from the wisdom of God in creation. Where I'm from, in Brittany, one of the Celtic nations, the sea resorbs so much that you can have the impression that the beach is just a flat sand desert. Often, our experience of the divine takes this shape. We often wait for guidance or feel overwhelmed by a tide of heavens. This season of Advent encapsulates our experience by a slow, wave-like progress of God's light in the world. You can see it in the candles that people light in most churches each Sunday, one more for each Sunday, and blow out at the end of the service. Little by little, the light enters the world until candles are not needed anymore. the light is entering the world, it doesn't replace, despise, colonize, or burn it. I say it because it is indeed a baby in a very paradoxical way, in the mysterious radiance of its flesh, who is going to show us the true relation to our own bodies and the world. A baby will reveal our small yet innate goodness, in dire need to be cared for. If we continue to light candles when we can simply turn on the light or be satisfied by the blue light of our screens, I think it is because candles are warm and sympathetic to the frailty of our lives and figures symbolically the nature of the baby God we are expecting. The flame of a candle also sways like a ship on the sea, which Celtic nuns and monks sail to bring the illuminating and transforming presence of their life to the continent. In this season of Advent, we also arrive at the limits of our known world, of our known resources as human to make sense of our lives and our world in a time of pandemic. We are living the limits which were the core to Christian Celtic experience. The old world is dying. Lo, a new world is coming. The candles of Advent and the witness of Celtic saints like St. Hilda remind us of our call to the limits, the only place where you can receive and share the goodness of God. A presence comes in little by little to visit you. It is very calm, very tender, so calm and tender that you can only feel its love and peace and want all creation to feel it through your love and actions. This slow rise of love and tenderness in God's weakest servants is God's remedy to our world's violence. All other ways despise the kindness of the candle's light and the frailty of the coming and the wisdom of the tides. This gentle way is God's way to work our reconciliation with Him and amongst each other. The frailty is often frustrating for us. We're so used to telling or forcing the truth on ourselves and on others. Yet, what the season of Advent prepares us for is not only the shining of truth that is radically different from the one we create amongst ourselves, but also to know God's truthful ways, which is the one of patience, attention, and gentleness. It is as if sun were rising in the west, where no one expected it to rise, with the slow and tender brightness of candlelight. Have a good season of Advent.
Thank you, Joris. I found that very moving, and I know it was extremely well received at Harvard Divinity School by the people who were there for that midweek service, and it made a wonderful reflection and a great start to our Advent season that is just round the corner for us. Are there any comments or anything that you would like to bring to our attention around Advent, around the other things that we've discussed this evening? Anybody experienced Advent in different ways? I know in England I used to look forward to it because of the Advent calendar. And I have one this year too, with chocolate behind every window, which I'm very much looking forward to opening. It was also, preparation for the coming of Jesus in England around Christmas time was a massive event. It involved lots of Stir-Up Sunday, which was a Sunday where you'd make your Christmas puddings because the collect in church was "Stir up thy people, O Lord, to good works." So you'd lay your Christmas pudding aside. There was Christmas shopping to do. All of those things didn't seem that religious, to be honest, for the season of Advent, perhaps, but perhaps things are changing a little bit more now. Joris, would you like to finish off with a prayer for us?
Dieu Tout-Puissant, tu as fait du crépuscule, de l'aube et de la pleine lumière une même journée, et tu fais connaître au soleil l'heure de son coucher. Nous t'en prions, dissipe les ténèbres de nos cœurs, qu'à ton éclat nous puissions te reconnaître, toi, le vrai Dieu, la lumière éternelle qui vit dans les siècles des siècles. Amen.